Welcome to a different venue from what we had yesterday. We were in the council room yesterday. Now we are in the chapel of King's College. Let me just say a little bit about the chapel. The chapel was built and designed by George Gilbert Scott, a great Victorian architect. It was originally completed in 1831 and then underwent some reconstruction in 1859 and underwent various developments in the period since. But in 1996, there was initiated a complete restoration program for the chapel, which brought the chapel back into line with the original design and vision of Gilbert Scott. And at great cost and great expense, the chapel was redesigned and then formally opened in the early 2000s. The chapel is at the heart of the life of the college. Morning prayers are said in the college every day. On Wednesdays, there is a Church of England communion service at lunchtime. And then on Thursdays, there's the Roman Catholic Mass and the Orthodox Vespers. The chapel plays host to a magnificent choir, and some of you know, of course, of the choir. The choir are, I would probably say, they're certainly nationally renowned, but they also have an international appeal as well. They go on tours. They are regularly recorded for the BBC and other radio programs and have made CDs. And we are incredibly proud of the choir here. And we've just had, in the past couple of weeks, we had our Advent services, 3 services over 3 consecutive nights. And these events are usually, well, always, I would say, they are heavily booked out and oversubscribed and are great occasions annually in the college. So I'm welcoming you on behalf of the college team. It's good to have Robin with us today, who's in the panel for today's discussion and giving a paper. So I'm going to hand now over to Chris for this morning's first session. Chris.
So today we really are turning to the exegetical nitty-gritty. So we're in for a treat with the papers. I don't think Douglas needs an introduction now, but it is a real pleasure to have the Reverend Robin Griffith-Jones here today. He's Master of the Temple at the Temple Church, and he's a visiting senior lecturer here at King's. And if you Google his name, you will find his webpage, and you will see he has written widely on the New Testament. In fact, one on Paul's Gospel as well. So it's a pleasure to hand over to you guys. I thought how we could do this today is, Doug, I think you're going to present first, and then Robin, you follow up. If then, Doug, you could give a short response, and then we'll open it to all of you guys. Okay.
Hi, everyone. It's a bit of a shock to be back here so quickly. I'll do my best. We're going to begin today by seizing the bull by the horns on the assumptions that we're dealing with a bull and that chapters 1 through 3 of Romans are its horns. Despite what some have said, Romans 1 to 3 is generally read prospectively or forward, setting up an Arian or foundationalist variant within Paul's theology, more broadly in the form of Western contractualism. So we need to engage with this text carefully if we're ever to rid Paul of this problem. Without a forward construal of Romans 1 to 3, I would suggest that this sort of dangerous perspectivism has no decisive claim on the apostle's thought. With this construal, however, it can lay claim to a significant cluster of his texts, but has the largely unacknowledged enthusiasm of many Pauline interpreters for Western contractualism, generally on the mistaken assumption that this is the first phase of the gospel, led to this construal of Romans 1 to 3, in spite of what these texts are actually doing in detail. Has a subtle misconstrual of Paul's argumentation unleashed a monstrous distortion into his dogmatics? Well, the short answer, in my view, to both these questions is yes. But some of my interlocutors have challenged me immediately here, denying that such perspectivism is present in the broader interpretation of Romans 1 to 3. There's no such dynamic in play, and my anxiety is a mere paranoia. they assert. So before I can suggest a rereading that will solve our problems, I have to pause to consider if the problem I'm trying to address is really there. I don't think this is very smart on the part of my critics. I don't think it's very wise, because I think this tactic collapses very quickly. But so many people have done it, I have to talk about it, so I apologize for that. So, to switch metaphors, we need to ask first if the Titanic is happily sailing intact and secure on towards New York, or if, as Campbell avers, it has struck an iceberg and been deeply damaged. So here's my account of the fatal iceberg. If it exists, departing a little from my narrative, we will try to repair the damage and sail on with a new reading of Romans 1-3. Okay. So we've discussed this problem already in numerous terms: Arianism, foundationalism, perspectivism, Western contractualism, conditionality. But in this paper, I'll refer to it as forward thinking, or FT, understanding this forwardness in specific terms of epistemological foundationalism. I think Richard made a really helpful distinction here yesterday between different types of forwardness. So the sort of forwardness that I'm worried about, particular sort. We must ask here then, first of all, if Paul is generally held to be arguing forward in Romans 1-3, building from an account of a problem, and so really of the problem facing all humanity, to a definitive account of the Christian solution offered in the gospel, thereby unleashing Arianism within his broader interpretation. We have to ask how all this happens in specific relation to the text. Many have not apparently been able to see this. So let me suggest here, forward thinking is present in the text and straight away, and hence in anyone who reads this material in a certain fashion, and they usually do. So, in its first paragraph, Romans 1-3 offers its auditors an argument in terms of FT, forward thinking, introducing the argument's key premises in the first few verses, while an appropriate conclusion rounds off the account in verse 32. It's wrath here, isn't it? Yeah? I spent 8 years learning to say wrath. I've just got on top of wrath, and now I'm back to wrath, which I think sounds rather better, actually. Okay, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven on all the impious and on all the impiety and ungodliness of people who are suppressing the truth by means of their unrighteousness, because the knowledge of God is apparent to them, or plain to them, for God has made it plain to them. For his invisible qualities, from the foundational creation of the cosmos, being perceived by means of the things that have been made, are perceived, namely his eternal power and divinity, so that they are without excuse. So here a God is known universally, inferred from creation by the mind, tois poiemazin noumena, okay, perceived by the things being made. Quote, he, unquote, is transcendent, because not really a guy, obviously, but also ethical, and is in fact poised to judge the sinfulness of humanity. The wrath of God is being revealed on all this impiety. That is, the natural knowledge of God is developed by the text immediately in more detailed ethical categories, which humanity goes on to violate. And the result is a descent into depravity through 3 stages of idolatry, sexual immorality, and general viciousness that God is held finally to, quote, judge righteously with a sentence of death, which also would fall on latecomers, right? Indeed, so obvious is this entire arrangement that the brazen sinners mentioned climactically in verse 32 acknowledge it, epigonontes. I'm only teasing. I'm sure you won't be judged. Certainly everyone is, quote, without excuse. An apologetos, an apology, without apology or defense before God. This is a compact formulation of forward thinking or justification theory. Note how the conclusion of the argument that brazen sinners, obviously and appropriately merit a sentence of death from God follows directly from the truth of the initial premises in verses 19 to 20. The universal culpability of the brazen sinners is indeed only appropriate if those premises are both ethical and universally obvious. However, the text states that they are. Hence, this paragraph only makes sense if it is construed as an instance of forward thinking. It works prospectively as an argument in the full epistemological sense. Something is being demonstrated here, forward from universal self-evident premises. But there's much more to Romans 1 to 3 than its opening paragraph. How does the entire text function prospectively? And this is a crucial move. By the assumption that the rest of the text, i.e. through 320, functions in the same way as 118 to 32. This is the move. That is, as a continued argument from self-evident premises forward to a depressing universal conclusion about human sinfulness and pending divine judgment. But we need to make a further set of exegetical assumptions in order for the text to operate this way. Right? The premises underlying 118 to 32 are summarized again in the text in 2:6, in a brief but critical affirmation of divine judgment in accordance with the Zert. You're familiar with this text. God will give to each according to his or her works. To those, on the one hand, who in accordance with a perseverance in good works are seeking glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. And to those who out of jealousy or discord and disobedience to the truth and who are thereby persuaded by unrighteousness, wrath and rage will be given. The text goes on to emphasize this. This material, 2:6, summarizes the position delineated at more length in 118 to 32 just previously. Now, it was grounded there explicitly on universal self-evident premises obvious to everyone from nature, as we've just seen. But this commitment to general revelation is reaffirmed shortly after the second statement of principle 2 in 2:12 to 16. And the text signals this tight conceptual linkage between 118 to 32 and 2:6 to 11 overtly when it turns on this interlocutor in between these two affirmations, who doesn't practice what he preaches and has made himself subject to the theology of his preaching. So his judgmental preaching is the content of 118 to 32, and then the application of that preaching is summarized in 2:6 to 11. So these two texts are parallel affirmations, and you have to interpret them in alignment. Okay? Now, in view of this correlation, the argument of Romans 2:1 through 3:20 will reproduce the forward thinking of 118 to 32 if this premise in 2:6 is taken to ground the rest of the contentions in the text through to 3:20 in a universal self-evident demonstration. So it'll function in parallel. And this is a reasonably plausible reconstrual of the text. The overarching argument through 3:20 can function as a demonstration from these premises of just universal condemnation, although it's a little curious that a series of arguments suggesting this self-evidently through to 3:9 are corroborated by a massed scriptural assertion of the same. That's an argument from special revelation. Nevertheless, we get what sounds like the right conclusion in 3:19. We know that whatsoever the Torah or the Scripture says to those in the law, it speaks, so that every mouth might be stopped and everyone, all the cosmos might be submissive to God. But in the light of this broad function in terms of condemnation that ostensibly becomes so apparent in 3:9 to 20, we might ask why Paul's text doesn't just jump from 132 straight through to 3:9, when Jews begin to be vacuumed up into its web of condemnation by the massed voice of Scripture. The extended tirade before this seems a little redundant. We don't even need the first part. We could just jump straight to the voice of Scripture. Here we come to a further critical assumption in the forward construal of Romans 1-3. Very important move. The intervening material from 2:1 across to 3:9 is understood to be an attack on Jews in the same self-evident terms that were operative vis-a-vis pagans in the first paragraph. That's the crucial move. The text does fold back, as we've just seen, on a judgmental but hypocritical figure. He's held to the standard of his own preaching, and the argument thereby supposedly begins to demonstrate how the Jew, considered in and of himself, independently, self-evidently fails, just as the pagans did. The Jew is a sinner too. That's what really matters. Okay. However, it is important to appreciate further the premises of the argument dictate the configuration of Judaism apparent in this Jew as well. That is, the premises already derived from natural theology by the pagans. Same premises. Hence, the Judaism that implodes from 2:1 through 3:9 is configured in terms of desert, minimally, a straight reproduction of the premise already seen to be at work in relation to the pagans. So there's no significant difference between a pagan and a Jew, and self-evidently so. The Jew is just the quintessential everyman, the quintessential person. Strange. Okay, both the generic Jew and the generic pagan try to be perfectly righteous by works, both sin and fail, and both stand under the retributive judgment of God. They're all legalists, at which point you should hear Sanders wailing in the distance. Okay, and forward thinking now runs right through Romans 1-3, first for the Greek and then for the Jew. A further key concomitant of this construal now needs to be noted before we turn to criticizing it. This construal of Romans 1-3 in terms of universal condemnation has to function in the context of a broader argument. Okay? Because considered in and of itself, it's just a complete dead end. Everyone ends up being condemned by God, self-evidently. Everyone's damned, everyone's doomed, end of story. That's not a very good argument to put at the beginning of your letter. There's got to be something that comes after that. But if the possibility of another arrangement lies beyond this one, then this apparent dead end can be understood instead as placing a lot of pressure on anyone within it to reach out and open the single doorway that seems to lead out of it. That would be, in terms of the four spiritual laws, law 4, right? Yeah? So we've done 1, 2, and 3. Open the door. Consequently, it's very important the subsequent phase of Paul's argument in Romans can be construed in these terms as well. So this is really 3:21 through 4:25. Can we read this as the offer of a new saving arrangement, appropriated by a more manageable act than perfect works like faith? Well, of course we can. But that is a relatively recent reading. We've only read it that way since the Reformation. Okay. An important preliminary conclusion in my argument in Deliverance is now apparent. Any reader who holds that Paul is himself committed to the premises underlying 1:18 to 32 and then 2:6, that premise of desert, is endorsing FT. Doesn't matter whether you want to, whether you think you're doing it, whether you don't think you're doing it, whether you think you're reading Luther properly, whether you don't. If you line Paul up with those two premises in the argument, you've locked him in to forward thinking irrevocably. Okay, that's important. Now, some have asked me where my account of justification in Paul comes from, which is sometimes spoken of as justification theory or JT. And this has caused a bit of confusion, so let me say, in the interest of clarity, I've got something very specific in mind. The problem in Pauline studies that I target in Deliverance as JT, or justification theory, or the justification discourse, or forward thinking, is simply unleashed by anyone who reads Romans 1-4 in this way, this usual way, forwards, and who then reads anything else in Paul in the same way. And this will happen if the argument of this passage is construed as functioning from universal self-evident premises to a conclusion of universal sinfulness. Now, I don't think Paul or any of his later interpreters is reducible to this position, but if we commit to these premises at any point, we necessarily unleash a wave of destructive confusions and contradictions through the apostles' broader interpretation. I think we experience this simply as cognitive dissonance deep down. I've lost count of the number of people that I run into who've listened to a bit of chit-chat from me, maybe about participation and how to line that up with justification. They say to me, oh, finally, Paul makes sense. I've always had this sense deep down that something wasn't adding up. Couldn't put my finger on it. Now, it all seems to be a unified picture of the gospel. I think what they're doing is by losing this Western contractualism, all of a sudden, Paul is speaking like an integrated figure. So we're not necessarily in touch with this sense of deep confusion. But it's there, and it's messing with us. Okay, I probably don't have to get too defensive about all this here, but my reviewers, you see, are always denying this. Douglas Moo, whom Chris mentioned yesterday, is a really interesting example. He says that my account of justification in these terms is completely manufactured, doesn't exist anywhere. The next edition of the Journal for the Study of the New Testament is going to have 45 pages by Barry Matlock saying basically the same thing. Campbell's made the whole thing up. But then Moo turns around and says that he likes it anyway. So it's not what I say it is, it's what he says it is, and it's good, even though I say it's bad. So a lot of prevarication and obfuscation going on. It's in the text, okay? It's in the primary text, it's in Paul. So I actually think it's difficult to find those who don't endorse it in relation to Romans. Even famous revisionist interpreters of Paul, in the modern period like Dunn, Stowers, Jewett, tend to retain this type of forward construal of the argument. They fiddle with its internal components and motifs, but they don't really deal with the underlying problem. Perspectivism is still being unleashed. In other words, the new perspective on Paul leads us nowhere in terms of these particular texts and concerns. Hasn't grasped how radical the problem is and how radical the solution needs to be. Someone might say at this point, well, so what? The perspective reading isn't really that bad. After all, we've lived with it for some time. Hasn't done that much damage. Might even have done a little bit of good. People got saved, didn't they? People have said that, and they're right. The forward reading of Romans 1-3, however, is not a happy construal, and it's time to remind ourselves why. We're just going to concentrate on one of its difficulties that we mentioned yesterday. What happens to Judaism in Romans 1-3 when these chapters are read forward? Exactly the same awful things as happened in Galatians 2:15-16, except worse. The Jewish figure apparent in the text must be characterized as the Jew because, as we've seen, the argument is a foundational, universal one, grounding the progression to a gospel beyond law-observant Judaism. And this construal is immediately committed to all the historical and theological difficulties that we noted earlier in relation to Galatians. But the Judaism addressed in Romans must also be defined as the more detailed text dictates. In terms of a judgmental person who is apparently a hypocrite as well, 2:1-6, his relationship with God is based on a strict moralizing contract revolving around works informed by the law, so it's highly conditional, 2:6-11. In fact, he's really no better than a good pagan, 2:12-16. You can accuse him of theft, adultery, sacrilege, and hypocrisy, 2:21-23. He's so immoral, pagans slander his evidently false deity, 2:24. There's even something superficial and dispensable about the bodily dimension of his Jewishness, 2:25-29. Naturally, he complains about all this, 3:1-9, and he is roundly condemned in every respect by Scripture. Now, we need to be both honest and clear at this point. If this is the universal, self-evident definition of the problem on which the solution by means of faith alone will build, then the foundations of Paul's soteriology are intrinsically anti-Jewish. This is a nasty description, in addition to being merely false, which makes the gospel nasty and false. The entire arrangement is also somewhat unjust, asking people to fulfill demands that it turns out in their corruption they cannot possibly fulfill. It is also historicizing, reductionist, bi-covenantal, non-Christological, and so on. Not good things. But if we read Romans 1-3 forward, this is what Paul's gospel has to be all about. Paul is locked into this description, at least until other engagements with Jewish issues in his letters have been factored in. But the damage has been done. But this is just the Jewish problem in Romans 1-3, and a brief account of it. I could go on and on. There's so much more to say. All the other major problems noted briefly yesterday are set in motion by this construal as well. The collision with retrospective thinking, participatory thinking, the distortions of conversion and mission, the subversion of Paul's revealed truth claims, especially concerning Christ, the harsh construction of other outsiders, to name the main ones. But the exegesis of Romans 1-3 in these basic terms has got its own direct exegetical difficulties as well. In particular, long puzzlement over what to do with a group of pagans who are apparently judged righteous by their deeds. Have you worried about these folk lately? We ought to. 2:13-16, 2:26-29, these guys show up, judged righteous because of their deeds which they've cognized about from the cosmos. This is a glaring anomaly if the argument is supposed to be demonstrating the universal sinfulness and culpability of all. Very bad idea to introduce a major category of exceptions to your main rhetorical point, if that's where you're going. Okay? So, I agree with Sanders that we face an interpretive crisis at this point. However, unlike him, I view this crisis as deeper and broader than even his characterization, as basically destroying Paul's account of the gospel and not merely his Jewish description. In short, I take it there is an iceberg and we have struck it. But there is a way to repair this ship. I hope. Just the solution that we already noted in relation to Galatians 2:15-16 could work in Romans 1-3 as well. An understanding of the text's concerns merely antithetically, presupposing a revealed gospel of faith that could then release Paul's engagement with something revolving around works of law from having to function either foundationally or as a description of Judaism, and more in relation to another gospel. Although here as there, we have to ask if this argumentative possibility can be realized on the ground in rigorous exegetical terms. So this is the $64,000 question. Can the argument of Romans 1-3 be read in a way that is not foundationally prospective? Yes. The text of Romans 1-3 works beautifully as a Socratic exercise, specifically as the reduction of another soteriological position that involves works of law to absurdity, and in several respects. Now, in this construal, all the vulgarities and excesses that we noted briefly previously, the crass construction of Judaism, the presence of righteous pagans, all this kind of stuff, all of this stuff now works in its favor, because these are all aspects of an opposing position that Paul is seeking to embarrass on its own terms, and not conclusions that Paul himself is endorsing. The reason why this stuff is so weird is because Paul is saying, if you believe that, you end up believing weird stuff. I mean, how complicated is that? Yeah? They are then, or they should be, the Socratic arguments, very dynamic. And I have to pause here just to emphasize, I think I've mispresented this reading. I've talked about it in different ways. And it's kind of late breaking for me that really what I should have been saying for many years now is that the argument is Socratic. It is a Socratic reading. So what I'm suggesting is really aligning it with the sort of texts that we find in Plato, and then the subsequent uses of the dialogue in the philosophical tradition and people that read that tradition and were familiar with it. This, I think, is what is going on. So, think Plato or Socrates. The vulnerable opening of this alternative position is epitomized in 1:18 to 32, since, of course, Paul's Roman auditors need to know what it is. Rather as Cephalus, Polemachus, and Thrasymachus lay out their rival positions in the opening stages of Plato's Republic. In my ambition, I had purposed to read all of Plato's dialogues before coming to this conference, but I got through one, the Crito. And what do you know? Actors walk on the stage, big speech by them, and then Socrates starts to go, well, hold on a minute. Did you say that, and this, and that? How does that fit together? And they go, blah, 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 blah. And he goes, well, what about this? This is kind of how they work. You give a guy enough rope to hang himself. This is how they work. Okay. But Paul's rival is, of course, fundamentally Jewish, and hence the resonances of this paragraph with the wisdom of Solomon. He's not going after a Greek philosopher, he's going after a Jewish guy that he thinks is misunderstanding Judaism and bringing that into Christianity. And I think that angry missive is probably an important text within his rival's discourse. So the key premise in this opening is isolated and then universalized in 2:1-6, very standard trick in philosophy. That is, it's applied to the preacher of the system and not to the generic Jew or to the letter's listeners. And a series of embarrassing reductions are then run through the remainder of chapter 2. So listen to how the argument works rather better if we think about it this way. The first thing we learn after this isolation and universalizing of this principle that this guy is committed to is that pagans don't actually need to embrace any gospel involving Jewish practice at all in order to be saved. In terms of the way this fellow's opened the argument, they just need to act in accordance with the moral revelations of nature to be judged righteous. Okay? And we've now explained the presence of these righteous pagans in Paul's argument. You're trying to convert people through this opening? If we take it seriously, the one thing that they don't have to do is convert to what you're saying. Good opening, brother. Keep it up. Okay. So their existence, these righteous pagans, embarrasses the Jewish Christian preacher advocating Jewish customs like circumcision and Torah observance, but on the universal self-evident grounds initially enunciated in the wisdom of Solomon. If you want to convert pagans to Christianity that's Jewish, we might say, don't begin this way, because it's self-defeating. Paul moves on, however. Nothing in this, quote, gospel, unquote, obviously saves Jews either, Paul continues in his second reduction in 2:17-24. As we learn from the story of certain notorious rabbinic charlatans at Rome. That's what I think is going on in this text. There's an allusion here to a very, very famous episode. In 19 AD, as every Jew and possibly every Roman knew, Tiberius had expelled the Jewish community from Rome because of a scam perpetrated on a Roman noblewoman. This was the Bernie Madoff scenario of the ancient world. That may not resonate here quite so strongly as it does for my usual audience. But trust me, that really hurts when you're preaching in America or teaching in America. Okay. Fraudsters posing as religious figures, or perhaps genuinely religious figures overcome with greed, had absconded with a large offering of silver intended for the Jerusalem temple. And this is what led to, this caused a scandal, and so Tiberius turned around and said, well, out of Rome, all of you guys. And hence Paul's lurid charges of theft, sacrilege, hypocrisy, and immorality in the text. Paul isn't attacking Jews universally in these terms. He's demonstrating circumcision and training in the Torah don't necessarily lead to virtue and hence to salvation, because these guys prove that it leads sometimes to really bad stuff. Conversion to Jewish customs is therefore doubly useless, and Jews might find themselves in trouble on this day of judgment, as Paul's rival depicts it. Okay, So we've got two reductions running, yeah? Righteous pagans can save themselves, Jews not necessarily saved. Now, these two possible reductios generate a painful possibility in combination. That these uncircumcised, did I have my pagans over here? And my Jews over here? I think I did, didn't I? Yeah, okay. The uncircumcised but righteous pagans will mock circumcised but sinful Jews on the day of judgment. That's got to be bad, okay? So, and now a third reduction comes into view. The principle of desert, operative self-evidently in nature, actually defines anything specifically Jewish out of existence. Jewishness, per se, is now redundant. It's an inference so shocking that commentators have generally not known what to do with it, although it works beautifully as a Socratic reduction. It's really interesting to see the commentators, they just slide over the top of this. If you take what Paul says here with absolute seriousness as a statement of his own position, you can make no sense of any of his commitments anywhere else to Jewishness as a particular historical, distinct, and important form of life, because he's just defined it out of existence in Romans 2:29. So we ignore it. But it's in the text, okay? So let me make a suggestion. Paul is not suggesting erasing his ancestral tradition. He is merely suggesting that the teacher's aggressive rhetorical opening, grasped clearly, erases his ancestral tradition. But Paul is not done yet, although I almost am. He goes on to elicit in 3:1-9 a reaffirmation from the teacher of the principle of divine judgment in relation to desert, which is characteristically of interlocutors in a Socratic discussion, offered a little bit too confidently. And it's a relief to have Paul now consistently asking the questions in this diatribal subsection, as well as throughout the broader argument, as a Socratic figure probably should. This means that he's offering views on Israel that are now consistent with what he says later on in the letter, so this is a good thing. God must judge even sinful Jews, the teacher thunders, and the condemnation of those who differ is deserved. And with his final trap set, Paul now springs it. But if you, this alternative gospels preacher, if you insist on maintaining your commitment to divine judgment, as you just have, stupidly, then you will find yourself in deep trouble, because the scriptures that we all endorse define everyone as being so thoroughly sinful. Now, your gospel can't deal with sin, as we've already established. So your gospel just ends up with everyone being sentenced by God to death, including you. And your, quote, proclamation, unquote, has thereby been reduced to a dumbfounded silence. That is, the existence of human depravity, which the scriptures attest to widely, must lead, in the teacher's terms, to universal condemnation. So far from being an announcement of good news, the teacher's gospel is actually an exercise in futility, in numerous respects, and self-evidently so. With this final realization, the teacher is, of course, reduced to silence. So that's my rereading in a nutshell. Now, the key realization in this alternative construal, Socratically, of Romans 1-3, which solves a lot of problems, I would suggest, is that Paul doesn't need to be committed himself to the initial premises for the argument to work. Indeed, it works better if he's not so committed, and the argument consequently folds back on itself, inexorably exposing the difficulties of any advocate of its initial premises in these sequential steps, and ultimately humiliating that advocacy. The puzzling redundancies and concessions of chapter 2 that we noted briefly earlier on now function as powerful argumentative moves on Paul's part. Conversion is pointless. Jewish superiority in these terms is ephemeral, and ultimately the entire arrangement is futile. Okay, so there's not enough time to note the many advantages of this reading here, although Deliverance does document them, arguably a little overzealously. I I think I end up with 56, and I think that was probably a mistake. I now will talk about 3 or 4. However, observe what has happened to this acute problem in the forward construal of Romans 1 to 3 with the Jew and Judaism that we noted earlier on. As in Galatians 2:15 to 16, this problem has now evaporated. Chapters 1 to 3 of Romans simply are not talking about Judaism per se, and the sigh of interpretive relief should be audible. Paul's actually going after a religious guy. He's not going after anything authentic. He's going after a contractual thinker. And he's using a Socratic move to show how it collapses on itself. So it's actually an incredibly useful argument for Christians. Very, very useful to deploy, because the battle against conditionality within the traditions of the church is an ongoing one. It's all around us. And we've turned this critique, this brilliant critique of conditionality, and focused it on outsiders. Because I think it embarrasses us. It's almost too good. Okay, but we're just talking about Judaism. We've lost that problem out of the text, and I just want to say that's a huge advantage in my alternative reading that my critics are sometimes not that cognizant of. Sanders' problem with respect to Judaism has been solved. Why fight it? I ask myself. But many have, and it is time to consider quickly how. How long have I been going for? Long enough? I have a little bit more.
Oh, well, let's hear it.
5 minutes? Let's hear it, he said wearily. All right. Okay.
Let's hear it.
Let's hear it. Here it comes. Okay. Some have been unhappy that more sources contemporary to Paul have not been cited by me supporting the phenomenon in the ancient world of what we modern people would call block quotation, which my reading suggests is the case for 118 to 32. I think there are some problems with this line of objection, though. First, it tends to overlook the positive evidence that I supply for the reading's cogency, which is argumentative, as we've just seen in specific relation to Judaism. There are good reasons for construing Romans 1 to 3 Socratically, not prospectively. It is a better argument. It's more responsible theoretically, makes better sense in context, and this is a set of exegetical contentions. It's a better reading. Can't just ignore it, okay? Even if you're going to be picky about cues and stuff, Robin, okay? Nevertheless, we should appreciate in addition that I think there is sufficient data in the sources explicitly attesting to the presence of block quotation in the ancient world to confirm its possibility for Paul. There's a letter genre that affirms it, the Ironicae. Pseudo-Libanius describes this type of letter, quote, in which at the beginning we praise someone by means of acting, but in the end reveal our goal, that what was spoken was actually acted. Nice. This is an apt description of what I suggest is taking place in the opening chapters of Romans. And children were taught to recognize this technique in school. It's described in textbooks preserved from Paul's day, the progymnasmata. So everybody was learning this technique in probably high school. So far from being a rarefied rhetorical technique, it was an interpretive staple. Moreover, all scholars accept that Paul himself quotes from an interlocutor at times and is close by Romans 1:18 to 32 as 3:1 to 9. Everybody thinks there's a dialogue going on there. It's not Paul if there's a dialogue. Paul, someone else. Paul, someone else. Okay? Furthermore, many scholars accept that Paul uses another distinctive voice in what we would call paragraphs as well, especially in Romans 7 through 25. It's quite a long text. I think the full speech in 2 Corinthians also is much overlooked, but very, very important instance of this. Paul flags it up a little bit more overtly there, but he definitely adopts the prosopon of the comic fool in that text. Brilliant speech. Oh, gosh, it's wonderful. I'd love to talk about that all day, but we must go back to Romans. Okay, so Romans 7. This strategy in Romans 7 has been recognized for a very, very long time. Origen is one of the most overt. He reads almost the entire text of Romans 7 in terms of prosopopoia. Prosopopoia is just acting, putting on a prosopon. So you're basically adopting the position of someone else. Although, in so doing, he and those like him were only reading Paul as we might expect in terms of a Platonic mode of discourse that was widely available and practiced in the ancient world, but is, of course, much less familiar to us. We do not operate in terms of Platonic modes of discourse. We're not taught to recognize them. We're not taught to write them. We don't see them, which is a real shame because they're a ton of fun. Okay. So it seems to me that the argument seeking to exclude my interpretation on grounds that insufficient ancient sources attest to it is inadequate. That Paul could quote someone else at length was an obvious cultural possibility for him, and that he quotes at times is widely accepted. Most importantly, that he could have argued Socratically, I think is really incontestable. That is a word that has greatly antagonized some of my critics, but I think it's right. I think it applies. Okay. But it may be helpful to recall further at this point that texts functioned very differently in the ancient world from our modern one, within a fundamentally different culture of production and reception. So we've got to resist the tendency for anachronism to intrude into subtle interpretive judgments that we're not really competent to make. Now, I owe the following to a classicist at Duke called William Johnson, who worked on the TLG for 10 years and then published a wonderful thesis. What he's done recently kind of really gets down into ancient reading culture, and he quotes this text from Quintilian. Very interesting. Our reading must be almost as thorough as if we were actually transcribing what we read. Nor must we study it merely in parts, but must read through the whole work from cover to cover and then read it afresh, a precept which applies more especially to speeches whose merits are often deliberately disguised. For the orator frequently prepares his audience for what is to come, dissembles and sets a trap for them, and makes remarks at the opening of his speech which will not have their full force until the conclusion. Consequently, what he says will often seem comparatively ineffective when it actually occurs, since we don't realize his motive, and it will be necessary to reread the speech or reread the letter after we've acquainted ourselves with all that it contains. Concealed textual strategy, standard move. Now, I have no doubt in view of this that Quintilian would have detected Paul's Socratic strategy and been delighted by it. And I take it further that attempts by modern New Testament readers to rebut my suggested construal of Romans 1-3 by pronouncing on the competence of ancient auditors are a little dodgy. Sketchy, dodgy. It's dodgy here, sketchy over there, right? Okay. But it will be profitable to make one final move. I'm actually going to make a Socratic move at this moment. Some of my critics, in a related attack, suggest that my construal of Romans 1-3 lacks explicit support. Where does Paul ever say that he's running a reductio? Fair enough. I think this is a false contention on one level. The interlocutor that I orient Paul's Socratic refutation around is actually overt in the text. He's right there. 2:1-5, 17-24, 3:1-9a. He's the most detailed character ever constructed explicitly in a Pauline text, with the possible exceptions of Abraham and Moses. But a further rejoinder to this charge is possible. Seldom seems to be noticed my critics tend to fail their own challenge at this point. They seldom offer any positive support for their own reading. Justify your own reading, you judger, I am tempted to say. Scholars tend to read Romans 1-3 as an argument, as we've seen, from self-evident premises to a particular conclusion. They read it forward. An enormous amount flows from this decision, a quagmire of interlaced problems that may render the broader theological description of Paul's gospel incoherent. This is an absolutely critical interpretive decision, one of the most important that we ever make in relation to Paul. But the readers that affirm this, in hostility to me, don't seem to feel the need to offer much justification for that judgment when they make it. Certainly none of my critics in print have offered any evidence for their conventional reading of Romans 1-3 that's apparently so obvious. So I asked them, here and now, were they in the room, Where is the explicit evidence that in Romans 1 to 3, Paul is arguing forward? Where does he say this? I'm about to prepare for the gospel's reception. I am going to do something first. I'm going to talk about the problem. Where does he ever say this, that his gospel is constructed in this way in any of his writings? That's the big question. The short answer to these related queries is outside of Romans 1 to 3, read forward, there is no explicit evidence that Paul presented his gospel in a foundationalist way, arguing from a primary, definitive account of a problem to a particular solution. What evidence we do have suggests instead the gospel was not presented in an epistemologically progressive fashion. As the word evangelion suggests, it was announced, proclaimed. So, I take any suggestions that I should point to explicit evidence saying that Paul is running a Socratic argument in Romans 1 to 3 as lacking self-awareness, indeed as lacking Socratic awareness, since this purported criticism can be folded back on the critic. And we must resign ourselves to the fact that, as usual, Paul never tells us explicitly how the argument in Romans 1 to 3 is to function. We reach a judgment about this passage after reading it through repeatedly, as Quintilian recommended, and considering it both as a whole and in its broader epistolary context, whether it reads appropriately as a praeparatio evangelica that spends a great deal of time crushing Jews in rather jaundiced terms, or rather better, as a cunning Socratic embarrassment of a Jewish Christian missionary rival. And it turns out that when we read it as the latter, all our problems disappear. With Judaism, with fundamental contradictions between forward and backward theological epistemologies, with apocalyptic, with conversion, with outsiders. So I repeat my earlier query. Why fight it? We have much to gain and nothing to lose. Thank you.
There are many, many reasons for keeping this short response short. First and foremost, I want there to be ample time to hear Doug's own presentation, his own prosopopoeia performed here this morning. He did tell me beforehand that he was still trying to work out exactly what persona he was going to give to his preacher. If it turns out that 11:30, that at 1:18 he puts on a plummy English voice, I will take it personally. Listen straight. No, we'll learn. It may be someone else. Lytton Strachey tells a good story about Newman. The Bishop of Oxford was rather worried about Newman, wasn't quite sure the man was completely sound and on message, so he sent a clergyman downstream to Littlemore to investigate. And this poor clergyman was clearly completely out of his depth as he held his conversation with Newman, as Newman invited him to navigate an oceanic depth of knowledge and insight and wisdom. So the clergyman walked back up to Oxford from Littlemore along the river. He had to report to the bishop, so he reported, and he said, "It is clear, my lord, that Mr. Newman no longer regards himself as a clergyman in the Church of England. He was wearing grey trousers." I feel rather like that clergyman. We are faced with Doug's extraordinary book, magisterial book, and here am I asking to be a pedant, just to nitpick at what I regard as a possible implausibility in Doug's account, which I think could be dangerous to the whole. I am not trying to undermine Douglas' Olympian argument, but I am trying to point out where I think there really is still some repair and some reinforcement to be undertaken. Well, we know Douglas' argument. At Romans 1:18, Paul introduces a new persona, an opponent of his own views who speaks till 1:32. The figure is not, of course, announced in the written text. The new speaker will have been flagged up by gesture, expression, tone, perhaps even the pitch and the character of the voice. Paul starts his reply at 2:1 with a clear apostrophe, o anthrope pas hokrinon, and this dialogic form continues with one very nice, brisk exchange at 3:1-9 in Socratic elenchic style through to 3:19, by which time the opponent's view, driven to its conclusion, has been reduced to absurdity. This device, 118 to 132, of block speech in character, credible or incredible? Now, it's too strong a question. Plausible or implausible? It's a matter of judgment. That's all it is. Well, is there really a problem? As Douglas has pointed out in many ways, no, of course there isn't. Speech in character, prosopopeia, pervades ancient literature, and Douglas has quite rightly emphasized the Socratic character of the device. But of course, Socrates' own dialogues were very, very famously dialogues. And indeed, at the beginning of Theaetetus, Euclid famously explains to Terpsion that actually in the scroll from which Euclid's slave is about to read out the full text, Euclid has deleted all the characteristic signposts that one would expect to find. He said, he replied, I answered. All of that is omitted, and Euclid must warn Terpsion, and hence the listener or reader of the Theaetetus, you're not going to get the signposts you are expecting. In any forensic or deliberative speech, can we find similar speech in character without a proper announcement of the speaker's introduction and of his identity? Well, Stowers and now Douglas invoke a valuable sentence of Quintilian. I quote, "Words in prosopopoeia may be inserted without the introduction of any speaker at all." Bingo. And Quintilian even quotes an example from the Aeneid, from Virgil's account of the Trojans' exploration of the deserted Greek camp. Ah. We thought they had gone, and were seeking Mycenae with the wind. The gates were opened. It was a joy to go and see the Greek camp, the deserted site, and the abandoned shore. And now comes the prosopopoeia. Hic dolopum manus, hic saevus tendebat Achilles, classibus hic locus, hic Achaeae certare solebant. Here the Dolopians stayed, here cruel Achilles, here lay the fleet, here they met us in battle. Stop. That's it. It's not speech in character at all. There's no character. It's just making something vivid. That's all. It lasts for 2 lines. It is not a block speech in character. It is the only example that Stowers gives. Now, in this morning's paper, and in the footnotes, which I'm sure will be online, Douglas has added some terrifically useful, good, further examples of the device that he understands Paul to be deploying. But they all have this very particular difference. The speech is clearly introduced, and the speaker is clearly identified. Why does this matter? At issue here is no grand principle, just practicality. How did Paul expect his letter to be effective if he did not make unambiguously clear that he was relaying the words of his opponent? There are reams of the stuff. Honestly, speech in character pervades all ancient literature. There's reams of it. Let me just give a couple of examples that Doug gives, and then move on rapidly to Cyril of Alexandria, Origen. You can just roll the stuff out. The Procailio, Cicero's very famous attack on Clodia, when Cicero invokes Appius Claudius the Blind, and with an enormous fanfare. If Appius appears, this is how he will plead, this is how he will speak. O woman, what have you done with Caelius? But why, judges, have I introduced so stern a person? Shall I take a more urbane tone? Then I will take Clodia, your youngest brother. Why are you making such uproar, sister? Why do you trouble this man who rejects your advances? Now I'm going to assume the character of a father. Why have you taken yourself into this company of prostitutes? And so it goes on. But every single time, the character is marked up, flagged up explicitly in the text. The same is true of Seneca's De Clementia, which Douglas adverts, and the passage from Quintilian, which we were just given. I'm really sorry, I don't think it makes the point. It is described as being a lesson in ancient reading culture. Oh no, it's not. What Quintilian is doing is giving instructions for bar students, law students. This is what you should do. You should get, and you should look out the manuscripts because they're in circulation. You should get hold of both sides of a case. You should read it through and see what the orator is doing. That's what you should do with enormous care. That is exactly what law students did then, and I can tell you, since my job is currently serving thousands of law students down the road, that is still what law students do now. You read both sides of the case, you investigate, and you see what was going on. Indeed you do. It is a study in forensic oratory. Now, we may say that's what Paul wanted or expected to be done with his texts. We may. That's quite a striking decision for about the performance of Paul's letter and its later study. It is, I think. Cicero was no doubt thrilled to have his speeches studied by students. But first of all, there and then, he had to win the case. Paul's letters were, of course, around for studying later, Colossians 4, as we know, distribution, yes, by those who had the means, the leisure, the time, and the manuscript with which to do so, yes. But first, Paul had, in Romans, I think, to counter, there and then, a crisis in the Romans' misapprehension of his own gospel. He had something, there and then, to do, and he must do it clearly. Oh, I don't want to be wearing. One could go on forever on this, of course. I'm afraid I think the ironic letter described by Pseudo-Libanius is, again, it's actually not an example, because the whole point about that, you see, is that you mislead your audience. You don't put on the voice of the plummy-voiced Englishman in the first half of the letter. On the contrary, you mislead your audience by praising them so highly, and you praise them more and more highly, and then only at the turning point you say, "You fools! You really think I meant that?" It's not speech in character. You read 1 Corinthians 1 to 4. There's masses of it. So you already rule. Yeah, well, how does it work? What it does not do is speech in character. On the contrary, he's teasing them. He's leading them up a garden path. Yeah. So I think what has happened is that Stiles and now Douglas have found two devices. The first is that very short and snappy dialogue, utterly familiar from Arrian's discourses of Epictetus. We all know them well, and indeed, I mean, that's just one of many examples. So-and-so is dead. Answer, apokrina, you see, flagging up. It's a dialogue starting, everybody, apokrina. That's beyond the control of reasoning will, not an evil. So-and-so's father has disinherited. Beyond the control of reasoning will, not an evil. Caesar has condemned him, beyond the control of the reasoning will, not an evil, and so on and so forth. But he flags it up. The first answer has apokrina, dialogue, everybody, dialogue. And then there are these long block speeches, which are consistently introduced. There is absolutely nothing strange about such long block speeches, and if in the plenary afterwards you want to hear some fabulous examples from Origen or from Cyril of Alexandria and their commentary on the New Testament, it's magical stuff, beautifully done, absolutely clear, bing, bong, bong. You can't miss it as it happens. The difficulty really lies in our imagining how and why an orator would deploy a long block speech with no clear introduction. I'm not digging in my heels here. We just have to make a judgment about likelihoods, a judgment based on as wide and alert a reading as possible in ancient literature. And I'm afraid that means not a wide and alert reading in the ancient theorists of literature. That is no substitute. Douglas and I, we both have a task to read all of Plato. Let me just use Origen at one moment here before we move on, because I must close just in a couple of minutes. It is surely in Origen, as Douglas pointed out, that the argument for prosopopoia in Romans has its most powerful witness. He saw the device at 714 to 25, and frankly, let's be honest, Origen had a far better ear for Greek and for its rhetoric than most of us do, so we should listen very carefully to what Origen says. However, Origen is actually a dangerous witness to call here. At 714 to 25, Origen does not glide readily and relaxedly into an exposition of Paul's speech in character. On the contrary, he is driven to it by necessity. He has just elaborated his argument, which he sustains throughout the commentary, that Paul at 7:7 to 25 is using law in a distinctive sense. And now Origen must explain how the spiritual Paul, speaking with apostolic authority, could possibly have spoken of his spiritual self as he speaks of the I in 7:14 to 25. Origen's answer: Paul here adopts the persona of a fleshly person, not spiritual, except at 725a, who is making his first efforts towards conversion. And Origen is quite clear. As with law, so with I. Paul uses them both with varying reference. Paul, faced with the obscurity of Paul's text, which he admits, offers the best solution he can find. Prosopopeia is his exegetical rescue mission. And this same Origen does not see prosopopeia at all in Romans 1. On the contrary, here he sees Paul expound the failings and destiny of the fleshly person who lacks all insight and all will to reformation. And I'll suggest in just a couple of minutes, Origen is a very good reader indeed. So, do you mind if I do this rather dull business, that the speaker sort of whisks through their pages? I'm very glad to think further about 1:17 to 18 and the structure, the parallel apocalyptitize, the gar in 1:18. It seems to me that the most natural thing for Paul to have done, if he wanted to do what Douglas says he was doing, was not to introduce an absolute recipe for confusion. Listeners with no idea who it was that this new voice suddenly represented, if new voice there was. No, it would be so easy. What would any orator do at 1:18, whose strategy was the strategy that Douglas ascribes here to Paul? He'd introduce the new speaker. Alla legoi tisan, hoti orga theu, ab urnu apocalyptitai. 7 words, 8 words. It's just a doddle. And that's it. The problem is solved. And what is by the way, tellingly, Douglas himself disputes one reading of Romans 7:7 to 25, because the listeners could not have understood who the I was supposed to be without some explicit markers to make that identity clear. And Stowers acknowledges the same problem. Well, it is just those markers that are lacking at 1:18. What was the danger in failing to give such markers? That nobody would recognize what Paul was doing. And indeed, for 2,000 years, until Doug, nobody has. So what should we say? I conclude. Well, it may be that this paper has just, as it were, loosened a block, and possibly even quite a large block, quite near ground level in the load-bearing wall of Douglas's argument. This block might indeed need some new cement put around it. Well, fine. That maybe just frankly is all we have to do. Let's do it. Or, Robin, are you really claiming that this possible weakness calls for the entire house to be condemned? Well, Douglas himself asks in his paper, what's to lose by accepting his argument? This, I think. Scholars are at last in our own generation giving due attention to Paul's rhetoric. This can make most of us nervous. We hope it will do to read the ancient theorists. It won't. There are volumes, bookshelves of speeches to be carefully read. If a scholar, on my left, constructs an Olympian argument which pays good, proper attention to Paul's rhetoric, we, the rest of us, are reassured. We accept the analysis of the rhetoric with gratitude and relief, and we turn back to the substantive topics which matter to us. Too soon. Too soon. Douglas has pointed out to us how much attention we must give to the rhetorical cues and markers in the letter. Absolutely right. This is not the moment to introduce an Aunt Sally or set off some completely new avenue, but Douglas raises a challenge, quite right. Frankly, he says, to those who find it hard to agree with him, if I'm wrong, Give me an alternative. That's an absolutely sound principle. And the answer is, I believe there is an alternative. I do. An alternative which gives better justice to Paul's rhetorical cues, which does justice, as it happens, to Origen as well. It all revolves around the healing of the nous. Paul's Romans letter is a therapeutic letter. The nous is described in 1:27-8 as utterly delinquent. The nous has been healed by the end of chapter 7, and at the beginning of chapter 12, the Romans are exhorted to carry on in the renewal of their mind. Precisely. The letter is a therapeutic letter. The letter is madly, wildly, deeply Socratic. It is a maieutic letter. It is far more Socratic than even Douglas's argument acknowledges, and this is revealed precisely by its rhetoric.
Well, thank you, Robin, so much. And you're absolutely right. The key point is whether there's a shift in voice. And wouldn't it be nice if Paul had told us what we needed to hear? The problem is, of course, that we're bringing that concern to the text from a much later point in the tradition and asking Paul to address our concerns when they may not have been his concerns. So if we are actually involved in this Western theological tradition, this is not something emphatically that Paul is involved with. He's not thinking, let me stress this point. We read Romans as a systematic account of Paul's position. This is how we come to the text. This is how the church has come to the text. It has read it that way for almost the entirety of its history. And this is a non-historical critical approach to the text. The only text in Paul's corpus where we utterly abandon our commitment to the circumstances of its production at the outset is Romans, because we've not really detected why it was written, what the practical circumstances were surrounding its production. And that is a bad thing. So even your rereading, your alternative reading that it's a systematic account of a therapeutic letter, you've got a job to do, which I'm sure that you will eventually do, but you need to tell us why he's sending a therapeutic systematic letter to Rome. And my account of why Romans is written is very concrete, it's very occasional. There are people either in that church doing damage, they're sitting in the back row, they're coming in through the door, they're in play, and this is why he writes the letter. It's got nothing to do with leaving a legacy for posterity. So the occasionality of the letter is extremely important. Now, a lot of humor and a lot of imitation and a lot of acting and a lot of comedic routines and a lot of drama, both in the ancient world and in the modern world, are highly localized and depend in part for their dramatic effect and their humor on the extra-textual cues that the audience and the performer share. And it's precisely this that generates the humor. Now, you probably will not be familiar with a show that runs in America called the Colbert Report. Have you ever heard of the Colbert Report? You have heard of it? Yeah, okay. Now, to my knowledge, Stephen Colbert has never said, I am now going to impersonate a stupid right-wing media broadcaster. He stays in character from the start to the finish. Furthermore, if he went into that show and stood up and said, I am now going to impersonate a fundamentalist broadcaster or whatever, all the comic effect would be lost. So it's important for that comedic function and that dramatic function that he doesn't disclose it. Some of you nodded, the rest of you have no idea what I'm talking about. If you got a tape of Stephen Colbert and you knew nothing about American culture, you would think that this guy was just a straight media presenter. If Martian scientists come down to Earth 2,000 years from now and dig up these tapes, they'll use them in the archive to reconstruct American political literature at our time, because they won't pick up these subtle cues. Is Rory Bremner still going here? I love that guy. I miss him so much. King's College alum, right? Now, Rory doesn't say, I am now about to impersonate Nick Clegg, I'm now about to impersonate Cameron, I'm now about to impersonate James Murdoch. The whole point is you get it because of the cues, and that's why it's funny. All right? In other words, there's a whole world of discourse that the Romans inhabited, in some ways I suspect they inhabited a much more subtle world of discourse than we do, especially in America. I think England is better on this. Great Britain is better on this because of the class system. Can I introduce James Scott in his work on hidden transcripts? You familiar with that kind of line of work? What Scott suggests is the overtness of the cues in your language depend on your class location, because high-class people don't pay a penalty for disclosing their points of view. So they have very overt, they're usually interested in status, fame, and posterity, and all that kind of stuff. So they have very highly signaled cues. The lower down the class system you go, the more dangerous it is to actually express your opinion, the more likely and temporarily it has to be cued, until it becomes necessary, actually, quite quickly, for it to be a transient text that cannot be attributed to you. It has to be cued very, very subtly, orally, and non-verbally. Now, the literature that Robin cited correctly, none of which aligns precisely with Romans as I'm reading it, doesn't surprise me because it's elite published literature. When you've published a book and set it adrift on the sea of reader reception, you've lost control of the situation in which it's being received. And you've got to put it out there. So when Cicero publishes a defense speech which has prosopopoia in it, he's got to flag that up for his published readers. He has to be quite explicit about it. So he gives us a sentence at the start and a sentence at the end. In an occasional situation that's highly circumstantial, where you control the reception and where you've got a much closer congruence between the sender and the recipient, you don't need to make those signals so explicit. And in some ways, if you do, the force, the comedy, the irony, the drama is actually diminished. So I think we've got to draw on that material as well, not just the elite published sources. Paul's writing, again, a slightly strange way of putting things. We read Paul as if he's white. And what my theological friends who are working on race issues mean by that is that certain texts reflect certain statuses, certain priorities, which come from the high end of society. But Paul isn't a high authority figure in conventional terms, and neither are the Roman Christians. They're black. And black discourse is completely different from white discourse. It flips it around and inverts it. And Romans, for me, is very much a ground level letter. It's not an elite text that comes from the high end of Greco-Roman society. So again, Quintilian, tutor to the emperors, doesn't get much more high end than that. That he overlaps in some of his recommendations with a technique that I think is going on in Paul's letter gives me grounds for saying that it possibly might be in play. I'm not looking for a direct correlation. I'm not saying that Quintilian actually underwrites this exactly. All right, so the occasionality of the letter I think is very important because it's not a published document. It's not a high-end elite document, so the signals don't have to be quite so strong. Secondly, origin. Yeah, I'm going to push back a little bit on origin. And origin's just an example of a use of a technique that's recognized. A lot of patristic people recognize prosopopoia. A ton of them do. And of course, he recognizes it, but he doesn't get an explicit cue in the text when he recognizes it in Romans. And also, there's a lot of argument in the Church Fathers about what's going on in chapter 3, where we get this dialogue, and different voices are identified. Pelagius has a ton of voices going on there. Again, no explicit cues. No explicit cues in any of the diatribal sections in Paul when you get this shift in voice. So I think that we have concrete instances of reading where the cue is not flagged up in advance. I wish there were more, but these are the ones that I have found. Third point, the text does signal explicitly that there's a turn, and that's at the start of chapter 2. Who are you, O judger? For when you judge others, do you not condemn yourself? Who are you? Who is this guy? Where's he come from? Who's he judging? You practice the same things that you condemn. That is a quotation from chapter 1, where people are practicing things and being condemned. So this guy he must have said the stuff that just preceded, because he's being condemned in terms of it. There's no way around this that I know of that really makes sense. Okay, so I think there are explicit signals in the text. And then his characterization later on in the chapter affirms this judgmental move, the speech that's been made up front. So when we have the diatribe bouncing back and forth, and nobody disputes that there are two people having an argument here, the way I reconstruct the text, one of the guys is standing up for the principle that was introduced in the speech, reaffirmed in 2:6, and then comes back, and someone else is hammering him for it. So this, I think, is very explicit. So when we get these cues, we go, aha, something is going on here. Maybe that's a speech. Fourth point, there are subtle internal stylistic cues in that paragraph. It is uniquely dense and pompous material for Paul. It has the highest concentration of alliteration in his corpus, the highest concentration of unusual words, the highest concentration of third-person verbs, making the prose kind of ponderous. It's got the densest utilization of the wisdom of Solomon. It's got a series of jokes in it, kind of slightly ponderous word plays. Paul very rarely does those anywhere else, and yet the wisdom of Solomon is stacked with this stuff. Okay? So the way I would put this, is very difficult for us to detect this because we're not competent Greek readers. And Robin, your Greek is probably a lot better than mine, so you probably squiz through these texts and detect these shifts in texture. But the way I would say this is it's as if you're reading a Charles Dickens novel and all of a sudden you hit a paragraph by Jane Austen. Now, if it's just slipped at something, you would recognize that and go, something odd is going on here. And I think, so there is a signal of oddness. There's kind of a ponderous quality, a turgid quality to this paragraph that has been recognized. There is a literature on this. There's a bunch of people that think it's an interpolation because these signals are so strong. Now, I think that's a bit flaky. I don't think there's enough textual evidence. But the fact that books have been written on the basis of this evidence suggests that there's something going on there. So there is a stylistic shift. Yeah, so those are my kind of four rejoinders. Having said that, yeah, no, I take your point on board. I really wish that someone else had thought of this. I wish that there was an editorial marginal note that said, oh, by the way, you know, new dude, watch for this. But I've just got to do the best that I can with the Pauline text that I have. And reading it in the usual way, I think, is such a disaster, and demonstrably so. And reading it this way solves everything. That gives me the confidence to make the suggestion, that this is a way through. So what I'm really saying is, yes, it would be great if there was a more decisive kind of package of external evidence. Is the paucity of the evidence, or the fragility of the evidence, because I don't think there's none, I think there's some, is the fragility of the evidence enough to overturn all the argumentative and theological considerations? And my judgment has been no. I don't think it's a decisive blow. Is it a blow? Yes, sure. I'll take it on the chin. This has been the main problem for people handling what I'm doing. To wit, a live performance of this text can help. Because...
Have you got the audio?
Yeah.
Guys?
Yeah, they have. Yep. Yep. Don't have high expectations for what is about to happen, okay? Because I'm really not very good at this. And I haven't had a chance to practice, but I shall do my best. Okay. Let's have a little look. Gotta get a character. Yeah. Well, I don't want you to be ignorant, brothers. Many times I've purposed to come to you. I've been prevented until now, so that I can have some fruit among you, some harvest, as I have amongst the rest of the pagans. Yes, the Greeks and the barbarians, the wise and the ignorant. I'm obligated to them. Hence also my passionate desire to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because the power of God is saving everybody who is faithful, Jews first and Greeks, because the deliverance of God is being revealed in it. It's a saving thing. Through fidelity, to fidelity, as it's written, the righteous one, through fidelity, will live. For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of mankind, who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them ever since the creation of the world. His eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. They became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became stupid. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed reptiles, four-footed animals, or reptiles. Therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in their own persons the due penalty for their perversion. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious toward parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. And yet they not only do them, but even applaud those who practice them. Therefore, you have no excuse when you judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. You say, we know that God's judgment on those who do such things is in accordance with truth. Do you imagine that when you judge those who do such things, and yet do them yourself, you will escape this judgment of God? Or do you despise the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But by your hard and impenitent heart, you're storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. For he will repay according to each one's deeds, to those who by patiently doing good seek for glory and honor and immortality. He will give eternal life, while for those who are self-seeking and who obey not the truth but wickedness, there will be wrath and fury. There will be anguish and distress for everyone who does evil, the Jew first, and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first, and also the Greek. For God does not respect mere appearance. So, all who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. Yes, and all who sinned under the law will be judged by the law. It's not the hearers of the law who will be righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. For when Gentiles who don't possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. Yes, they show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness. And their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them. On the day when God will judge the secret thoughts of all, according to my gospel, through Jesus. Yeah. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God, that you know his will and determine what is best because you're instructed in the law, if you are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then that teach others, why don't you teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You that forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? You that abhor idols, do you rob temples? You that boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So circumcision is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if those who are uncircumcised keep the requirements of the law, won't their uncircumcision be regarded by you as circumcision? Then those who are physically uncircumcised but keep the law will condemn you that have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision apparently something external and physical. Rather, a person, according to you, is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. This is done by the Spirit, not by the letter. Well, such a person receives praise, not from others, but from God. So, what is the advantage of the Jew? What is the value of circumcision? Much! In every way. For in the first place, the Jews have been entrusted with the very word of God. What if some were unfaithful? Isn't their faithlessness going to nullify the faithfulness of God? Absolutely not. Although everyone is a liar, let God be proved true, as it is written, so that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are being judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to confirm the righteousness of God, what are we going to say? God's being unfair to inflict anger and wrath upon us? I'm speaking, for the sake of argument. Absolutely not. For then, how could God judge the world? But if through my falsehood God's truthfulness abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? Why not say, as some people slander us by saying, that we should do evil that good may come? Their condemnation is deserved. What then? Are we any better off? Apparently not in every respect. Moreover, we have charged all publicly, both Jews and Greeks, of being under the power of sin, as it is written. There is no one who is righteous, not even one. There is no one who has understanding. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. There is no one who shows kindness, not even one. Their throats are open graves. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of vipers is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery are in their paths, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know whatever the Torah says, it says to those in the Torah, so that every mouth might be silenced and the whole world held accountable. Indeed, as it is written, no human is going to get pronounced righteous in his sight by deeds prescribed by the Torah. Through the Torah comes only a knowledge of sin. Thank you.